this lecture, we'd like to talk about Shopenhauer, one of Nietzsche's definitive influences. But more generally, we'd like to broach the question of pessimism, that view that the world and life really is no good. Pessimism, by one consideration, might be thought of as a kind of quantitative measure. The question, is your life more pleasure or more pain? And of course, most of my 20-year-old students argue without a hesitation that it's much more pleasure. And I remind them that it's not over yet, and I tell them some of the things that might happen to them, and some of the things that certainly will happen to them as they get older. And of course, in the end, we're all dead. And so they get very disturbed by this, but they're still perfectly willing to assert, or at least hope, that the balance will be in favor of pleasure. Schopenhauer doesn't believe that. Schopenhauer seems to feel that life is basically suffering, and that the amount of pleasure, well, take it, enjoy it, but it really isn't what life is all about. This quantitative idea that life is more pain than pleasure is, of course, subject to many different objections. For one thing, just the notion of quantification is itself rather difficult. How do we know what we're quantifying when we quantify pleasure and pain? But Nietzsche would want to say more to the point that pleasure and pain aren't really what life is about. But there's a different kind of way of thinking about pessimism, which is far more philosophical. The more philosophical way of thinking about pessimism is that life doesn't have a purpose, or life doesn't have a meaning. Now, there's several different ways that this might be argued. One, and perhaps the most common, particularly in the 19th century and now the 20th, is that what gives meaning and purpose to the world is God. Schopenhauer is an atheist. In fact, Nietzsche says in praise of Schopenhauer, he is the first honest German atheist. If there's no God, one might argue, then the world doesn't have a purpose. There's nothing to guide us, no ultimate goals that are given to us, and the world itself has no meaning. And if you look at the world as a naturalist, and in particular, if you look at the world as both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche tend to do, through the eyes of a biologist, then you can sort of see the point. What Schopenhauer argues, in exquisite detail, because he really knew a lot about the life sciences of his day, is that if you look at how creatures live, there's basically just one continuous cycle to it, and to talk about it having an ultimate meaning or purpose really doesn't make much sense. He uses as an example one of those many insects that develop over a long larval stage, emerge in some cases for a single day in their full maturity to mate, after which they quickly die, and their offspring, after spending some time in the larval stage, emerge fully grown, mate, and die. And this cycle goes on, in many cases, for millions of years. But of course, what does that add up to? It's just a cycle of life and death, but it doesn't add up to anything. It has no ultimate purpose. It has no ultimate meaning. If you watch your dog through his or her daily life, weekly life, monthly life, yearly life, we watch our dogs, whom we adore, now at age 11. And there's a sense in which they're now slow puppies. There's a sense in which what they want out of life is pretty much what they wanted out of life when they were 10 weeks old. There's a sense in which they have no anticipation of what is going to happen to them, not too soon, I hope. There's a sense in which what they do is they live for what they want to do that day. In fact, we sometimes joke. When a dog, and especially when a puppy wakes up in the morning, it's not just a brand new day. It's a brand new life. And there's this sense, dogs can have a wonderful life. I often envy it. But the truth is, what does a dog's life add up to? That, I presume, is what's meant by the phrase, a dog's life. Because most dogs don't live badly at all. Nevertheless, it doesn't add up to anything. It doesn't have a purpose. It doesn't have a meaning. And that, quite frankly, doesn't have all that much to do with whether or not dogs believe in God. The idea of life simply going on, fulfilling itself, repeating itself, is really the heart of a certain kind of pessimism. I remember a cartoon that was popular just a couple of months ago, and it was essentially one of these cartoons about evolution. The first frame was a little creature crawling out of the water, and in its little bubble mind, it was thinking, eat, survive, reproduce. Then it had another creature that was clearly a land creature, and in this little bubble of a mind said, eat, survive, reproduce. Eat, survive, reproduce. And then they had something that looked like a primitive primate who was thinking, eat, survive, reproduce. And the final frame was a human being who was scratching his head and saying, what's it all mean? And it seems to characterize very well. On the one hand, we're just another step in evolution, although I should point out that Shopenhauer is writing before Darwin. We're just another step in evolution. We are animals. But nevertheless, the idea that we are somehow special, that we are in a position to discover the meaning of life, is an illusion. Now, why is that? Because Schopenhauer had a view, and in fact it's remarkably similar to his arch-rival, Hegel, who was at one point teaching in the same university, Berlin, at the same time. And that is the view that the world is one, that it's a unity, that there is really one reality underlying all things. Schopenhauer, however, takes this view not from Hegel, whom he despised, nor does he even take it directly from the ancient Greeks, who sometimes held similar views. But much to his credit, Schopenhauer was the first philosopher to take seriously the philosophy of the Far East, Indian philosophy in particular, and he knew Buddhism, he knew a good deal about Hinduism, and the philosophy of Brahman that I mentioned before, the philosophy that the world is really one reality, was a philosophy that he embraced. But that one reality had a peculiar characteristic. It was in the terms that were widely used at the time. It was will. Now, the important thing for Schopenhauer is to understand what that means. The notion of will was used very centrally by the great German philosopher who preceded him, and he was certainly Schopenhauer's model, Immanuel Kant. For Kant, will was, first of all, something that each of us exercised, and will was necessarily rational. That doesn't mean that everything we do is rational, but it meant that to have a will and to have reason and to have morality, or at least have the understanding of morality, these were all of a package. In Schopenhauer, the will is no longer individual. The will is, in fact, the one reality. And we know the will through ourselves, but nevertheless, what we know through ourselves is reality as such. But of course, there's something else we know too. And to put it very simply, it's the world. In Kant, that old picture that comes from the Greeks, Plato and Aristotle in particular, the picture that comes through the history of Christianity of two worlds. One, a kind of immediate secular world, and the other of a more perfect world, takes the very sophisticated variation that on one hand, there's the world of our experience, what Kant calls the phenomenal world. And then on the other hand, there's the world as it is in itself, that is, as the world would be if we did not perceive it through all of our senses. Now that's an impossible notion, and Kant realizes that's an empty notion for us, But nevertheless, God sees the world, or knows the world, in a way that's very different from the way we know the world. And so that notion of the world in itself is something that Kant distinguishes from the world of our experience. What's more, that world as it is in itself has a function. It is, perhaps first and foremost, the realm of God. It is the otherworldly. It is also, however, the realm of human freedom and human action. And what we experience in ourselves, in fact, is the freedom to act, which is something different from seeing ourselves as just participants in the world. So with this dichotomy, Shopenhauer then says the following, and this is a combination of Kant and Buddhism. The world as phenomenon, the world of experience, is to a large extent a world of illusion. On the other hand, the world that we experience inside, the world of the will, that's the real world. And what's more, it's not individual will, but all wills are ultimately one. But most importantly, this will is not rational. This will doesn't have an ultimate purpose, as Kant certainly thinks it does. The will is really, I always think of it as something like a tornado. It's something that sort of swirls around and strives inside of us and throws us from one place to the other. It's always presenting us with goals and demands, desires. But it doesn't stop. It can't be satisfied. Perhaps the most illustrative example, one that Schopenhauer actually uses quite often, that all of us can relate to, is sexual desire. Think, for example, when you were a teenager and just discovering this. The experience was that here is this enormous force speaking to you from inside of you. And at the time, you had no idea where it was coming from, where it was going, what you were supposed to do with it. What you recognized, what you could not but recognize, was its power and its force. Well, you got more sophisticated. You realized there are ways of answering this desire. But are there ways of satisfying it? And the answer is no. Goethe in Faust says at one point, "From desire, of course, I rush to satisfaction, but from satisfaction, I leap to desire." The truth is that satisfaction is always followed by desire. Sexual satisfaction is very brief, and the desire comes back. And this cycle continues throughout life. In fact, one can ask the following question: what is it you desire when you have sexual desire? Now, of course, in immediate personal terms, it might just be, I want to make love to this person that I love. Or it might just be, I want an evening's entertainment. Or it might be, I want to prove I'm a man, or I want to prove I'm a beautiful woman. But all that's beside the point. The truth is, it's the will speaking from within us. The will as the demand for the continuation of the species. But there, we're right back to where the dogs and the insects that mate one day of their lives, and lower creatures as well, it is simply life insisting on reproducing itself, the species insisting on going on. But if the question is why, there's no answer to that. We are simply buffeted by the will, and that's the end of it.
Now that's a pretty bleak picture. The story of the universe that Schopenhauer tells doesn't give us much consolation. The one perhaps potentially consoling thing is that Schopenhauer claims that along with our general sense of satisfying our individual desires, something he claims is an illusion, he also thinks that it's really an illusion to concern ourselves with our individual existence. Ultimately, we're all one thing, and although for many of us overwhelming preoccupation is a concern with the fact that we're mortal, Schopenhauer claims that this is really a kind of illusory problem. If we're all this fundamental one force that expresses itself in nature, our individual death really doesn't mean much of anything. In effect, what goes on, nature, is really all that we were originally. So we might take comfort in the thought that what's really real in us, what's important in us, continues despite our individual demise. Nevertheless, not too many people find that all that reassuring, and Schopenhauer is well aware of it. The generally pessimistic tone of his writing has a lot to do with the fact that he thinks most of us aren't going to take any solace in that and aren't going to draw the appropriate conclusions. He does, however, mention a couple of ways that many of us at least avoid dwelling on what's unpleasant for us. He thinks that there is a kind of respite from willing and either getting satisfied and briefly bored, or willing, getting satisfied, and immediately willing again. The main way in which people take a kind of break from all this is through aesthetic experience. Indeed, I think it's noteworthy that while Schopenhauer paints a very pessimistic and disturbing picture of the world as a whole, his specific examples indicate, just in the way he writes about them, a kind of aesthetic appreciation. He takes joy in learning about biological examples. And even though the upshot is often exactly what Bob described, a kind of sense that this is a continuing saga that ultimately signifies nothing, nevertheless, one gets the impression that he really takes great delight in observing and recognizing the ways in which nature works. Schopenhauer's own theory acknowledges that this is the main way that a lot of us find at least temporary meaning in our lives. He talks about aesthetic experience as a kind of Sabbath from the penal servitude of willing. His conception of aesthetic experience draws on yet another of his philosophical heroes besides the Buddha and Kant, namely Plato. He draws from Plato's notion of the forms or ideas, prototypes for the particular individual things that we observe in the phenomenal world. According to Plato, for example, when we see something beautiful, we're seeing an instance that has many, many different illustrations, an instance of something that participates in a fundamental pattern, absolute beauty. And in a sense, when we recognize beauty in the here and now, in a particular thing, we're actually turning our minds towards something that's more fundamental, universal, and eternal, namely beauty itself. Schopenhauer's way of dealing with this notion of forms is to say that most artists depict particular things, but in a way that makes us mindful of these universal prototypes or patterns. So a sculptor that, for instance, sculpts a wolf will in a sense have in mind the basic prototype or pattern of a wolf. And it will be the universal notion of wolfness, you might say, that comes through in what the artist does, to the extent the artist really is in control of his or her art. What this does for us in terms of willing is it allows us an occasion to simply rest content with contemplating. Once again, the kind of contemplation we discussed in an earlier lecture becomes a very significant and important component of life. As Schopenhauer sees it, when we can just contemplate the basic patterns of the world, we no longer have our usual disposition, which is to gaze around us and itemize things in terms of things that I want, things I don't want, things that help me get what I want, or things that obstruct me. All of those kind of relations we have to things tend to put us in a rather aggressive, antagonistic, and ultimately frustrated state of mind toward the rest of reality. When we observe something in an aesthetic light, however, and Schopenhauer here would include beautiful nature along with art, what we do is transport our gaze away from particular objects of desire for me, the individual, to the universal beauty of this type of thing. Similarly, when I do that, I'm no longer relating to myself as an individual that either does or does not get what I desire. Instead, I think of myself as a kind of universal being as well. If I gaze at the universal form of something through a particular, in art or beautiful nature, at the same time I'm making myself a kind of universal case of a human being contemplating. Schopenhauer calls this the pure will-less subject of knowledge. I'm will-less because I'm not relating to myself as a private person with desires, perhaps with greed, but instead thinking of myself as the mind of the human being. And with that, I at least take a break from willing, trying to get what I want. For the time being, I don't even think about desire. Unfortunately, this blessed state of mind doesn't last very long. For the most part, we go to an art gallery and perhaps experience beauty, but eventually get hungry and turn our minds back to desire. If we're particularly unfortunate, we might even start thinking about desiring art itself, wanting to own rather than simply contemplate. So Schopenhauer thinks sooner or later, inevitably desire catches up with us again. There is, however, one other aesthetic kind of appreciation that he discusses and that Nietzsche draws upon, actually, the aesthetic appreciation we have of music. Now, Schopenhauer, being a 19th century thinker, does not have in mind the kind of abstract visual arts that are very common fare today. He tends to think of all the visual arts as presenting depictions or representations. On the other hand, he thinks of music as something that is much more formal. Music doesn't seem to be mimicking anything in particular in the world, although we feel that it has a very intimate connection with our world. And Schopenhauer's way of understanding this, again, a theme that Nietzsche picks up on, is that in music what we have is something like a representation of the will itself, the way in which the will moves through nature, the kind of inner conflict of the will, which we might see in musical dissonance, and its resolution in stages of relative consonance, for example. Schopenhauer is convinced that the reason we find music so moving is it bypasses representing things in the external world, and we feel more that it's intimately in connection with this inner stirring, the will as it acts in ourselves. So a musical condition is particularly important for us because, again, it draws our attention to what's universal within us, the very phenomena of the will manifesting itself through us. And by doing that, it makes us, again, mindful of our real existence, ourselves as members of a species, manifestations of a will, which fundamentally make us all one. However, like the visual arts, music usually doesn't sustain us through a lifetime. Even though we might be transported by the occasional concert, most likely we spend much of our life willing, getting frustrated, willing, getting satisfied and bored, and then willing again. The only ultimate solution for human beings is really to somehow move one's sense of self away from personal, private aims, the kind of everyday willing that we all engage in, to shift from that sense of who we are to a totally universalized concept. And that, he thinks, is something that the saints of various traditions have achieved. Schopenhauer's conception of life being full of frustration and desire draws a lot from the Buddhist notion of life being suffering. And Schopenhauer also follows the Buddha in suggesting that the only real solution to this is to get over this kind of continual craving. So if we can manage to start to see ourselves as really the same self as everyone else, competing with them for particular good things that we want seems rather pointless. If we really register this, if we really come to take this to heart, then the whole project of willing, trying to get what we individually desire, starts to seem more and more pointless. And if we really do maintain this kind of insight, then what will happen naturally is we'll simply stop. We'll come to a state of what Schopenhauer describes as resignation. We'll resign from willing. Now, how does all this relate to Nietzsche? Nietzsche tends to follow Schopenhauer a long way in this account. Nietzsche, as we discussed in earlier lectures, was quite convinced that life does entail a certain amount of frustration, downright suffering, and ultimate death. So he thinks Schopenhauer is certainly pursuing the right track to try to encourage us to think about this, to recognize the truth of this, and not whitewash it. On the other hand, Nietzsche thinks that Schopenhauer perhaps gives aesthetic experience a little bit too short shrift. As Nietzsche sees it, there is a kind of aesthetic way of dealing with the whole problem of individual frustration, suffering, and death. He comments in The Birth of Tragedy, only as an aesthetic phenomenon is life eternally justified. In other words, Nietzsche is suggesting that there is a kind of answer to the problem of evil that aesthetics, art, can provide. And this particular answer is an answer that has to do with seeing the world, in a sense, from this point of view of ourselves as universal. Instead of thinking of ourselves as just one more phenomenon, fighting it out with the rest, as we observe the world as an aesthetic phenomena, we think of the way all of these things go together. Nietzsche thinks if we really do this, it doesn't really matter to us as much that we're in the competition, in the general fray, and sometimes get frustrated during the course of it. That's simply what participating in life involves or entails. And that, he thinks, is something that we can come to grips with and actually appreciate, so long as we maintain awareness that that's our individual participation in this much bigger thing, this, in a sense, more real thing, life as a whole. One might compare the way that Schopenhauer and Nietzsche think differently on these issues by noting that Schopenhauer really thinks that ultimate satisfaction is what we really want. And we're going to be frustrated unless we get to a state where we're completely content. Nietzsche thinks that that really doesn't have much to do with life as it's lived, and if we think about it, isn't really what we want. The nature of life is to be in a state of continual change, a state of movement, a state, if you want to call it this, of frustration, but that this frustration is actually something we can appreciate itself, something along the lines of our appreciation of musical dissonance, which is a state, a particular moment in music where you certainly have the sense that you need to move from that, but that moving itself is what life consists of. Strangely, although Schopenhauer shares many of the presuppositions that Nietzsche does, Nietzsche thinks Schopenhauer is really looking for a kind of stasis, a state of perfect contentment, where you don't need to strive anymore. You're finally fully satisfied. And Nietzsche thinks what we ought to throw out is not our desires, but the sense that a kind of position of perfect satisfaction is either attainable or desirable. So Nietzsche does, in a sense, take a more optimistic view than Schopenhauer. He buys the pessimistic premises that start Schopenhauer's own philosophy, the premise that, indeed, individuals are inevitably subject to suffering and death. But nevertheless, he thinks that we need not look at this as a kind of argument against the value of life, taking a kind of source of sustenance from being part of life, from being part of the motion or the dynamic of life, rather than looking for a peaceful state in which to live out your days, is what we ought to do. Despite this relative optimism, however, Nietzsche is not favoring a kind of cheap whitewashing of reality. So he tends to think that too much focus on optimism, as some people who look at the Greeks and say, oh, how cheerful they were, he thinks that's not really a good thing either. That we should recognize that life involves these various negative components, but nevertheless approach the world with what he calls strong pessimism, a sense that we can really deal with this and even take joy in it.
Nietzsche's relative optimism, or what he often calls cheerfulness, I find not always convincing. You get the sense that here is a man who desperately wants to feel good about life and cheerful, but nevertheless there's a sense that throughout his entire life he's really saddled with Schopenhauer's pessimism or a version of it, and is trying to convince himself that life is really worthwhile despite all of the suffering. But this leads to another way of looking at pessimism and looking at the meaning of life. Schopenhauer ultimately seems to think that meaning, purpose, is to be found in a kind of rationality. That's what Kant thought. Nevertheless, what Nietzsche points out, and I think very powerfully, is that the meaning of life is to be found not in reason, not in rationality, not in some calculation, much less in theology, but the meaning of life is to be found in the passions. That it's creativity, it's being devoted to causes, it's being dedicated to something, another person, a project, an art, That's what gives life meaning. And so pessimism is overcome as an aesthetic phenomenon, not as a reason, not as a rational enterprise, but rather by something you really care about, something you feel deeply passionate about. One of Nietzsche's most exciting ideas, with reference to life affirmation, is the one that he calls eternal recurrence, or the eternal return of the same. It's introduced in a couple of his works. For example, it gets a notable place in Zarathustra as one of Zarathustra's main teachings. But perhaps the most famous introduction is in his book, The Gay Science, where he writes, "What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you in your loneliest loneliness and say to you, 'This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerably times more, and there will be nothing new in it but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you all in the same succession and sequence, even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, even this moment, and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, 'You are a god and I never have heard anything more divine'? If this thought gained possession of you, it would change you as you are, or perhaps crush you. The question in each and every thing, do you desire this once more and innumerable times more, would lie upon your actions as the greatest weight. Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate confirmation and seal?
The idea of time being a circle is actually a very ancient one, and it recurs in a number of cultures. The ancient Aztecs and Mayans, for instance, had a notion of the world being destroyed many times and then being recreated. And similar ideas occur also in India. Nietzsche was probably most familiar with the idea in its currency in antiquity, among the Greeks in particular. For example, Heraclitus had a kind of vision of eternal recurrence, as did the Stoics. And the Pythagoreans seem to have a view that in many ways conforms to the passage that Bob just read, the idea of events repeating themselves cyclically in exactly the same order. One of the reasons that I think Nietzsche might have found this idea so interesting is in part because of its deep-rooted past in the history of humanity. But also, the fact was that Christianity had turned against this idea, and therefore I think it has a certain kind of animus against the Christian orthodoxy, too, when Nietzsche brings it up. The reason that the idea was rejected by Christianity, and indeed the early Christians did have a number of debates about this, was that if you really believe that Jesus redeemed mankind and had taken away the sin of the world, it didn't make a lot of sense to have this happen over and over again. This had to be a one-time historical event. So in order to really believe the story of atonement and redemption, the view became cemented that there was in fact only one time, and that time in fact was linear.
The idea of time as a circle, time as linear, of course carried Nietzsche back into physics, which he did keep up with. And as Kathy mentioned in the last lecture, the move in physics at the end of the 19th century was to get away from the sort of Newtonian talk about mechanism and matter in motion, and instead to talk about energy, and in particular talking about energy packets and little points of energy. And Nietzsche actually, in his notes, and let me emphasize, only in his unpublished notes, plays with the idea of an actual physical proof of eternal recurrence. It goes like this. Time is infinite. Now, let's leave aside a contradiction that's already evident, that if time is a circle, it's not infinite in the linear sense, which this argument presupposes, but time is infinite. There's a finite number of number of energy packets in the world, and consequently a finite number of sequences of energy packets. And so in the infinity of time, the number of sequences is going to have to repeat itself an infinite number of times. Now let's not worry about the mathematics of it, but there's an obvious flaw in the proof right from the outset. Insofar as this is supposed to be something which, as everything in Nietzsche is supposed to, influences our lives and the way we live, if it's supposed to have the weight that he refers to in the quotation that I read, then it has to make some difference whether it's this sequence or perhaps some other sequence, whether I am me myself or I am someone else or not at all. But if, in fact, there is this infinite repetition, there is also the infinite repetition of every other energy sequence as well, so that not just this life, but every possible life that I could lead or any possible life without me would also repeat an infinite number of times, which I think takes the steam out of the argument. But Nietzsche never published this, and I think it's a good thing he didn't. It's like one of those notes that we read ourselves all the time, often on the napkin of the coffee shop or whatever, and we get home and we look at it and we think, this idea is really silly, I don't know what made me think of it. And Nietzsche was certainly wise not to publish this particular proof. But that doesn't mean he didn't believe in eternal recurrence. He certainly thought that this was one of his most fascinating thought experiments. And the idea is, as the suggestion in the quote as the quote suggests, is that if you take this thought seriously, that your life as you are now leading it is going to be repeated an infinite number of times, then the weight it gives to this life and to the moments of this life is incalculable compared to the Christian image that this life is but a blink. It's but a moment in time, and it's the next life, the eternal life, that gets all the weight. Milan Kundera, the great contemporary Czech novelist, picks up on this theme, and he uses it both as a title and the starting meditation of his great book, Unbearable Lightness of Being. And it has to do with the notion of events repeating themselves an infinite number of times and consequently having a certain amount of weight. So we think about our lives, and the question is, would we tolerate the idea of that much weight on the way we live? Instead of rationalizing, as we so often do, well, this will be over soon, or this is only a couple years of my life, then I'll get to do what I really want to do. Or it's just this life, and of course this is suffering and toil and ultimately meaningless in its own terms, but there's another life, a more perfect life, awaiting for me somewhere else. Instead of that kind of thinking, what if we really took the moments of our lives seriously? The result is a kind of a test. It's also a psychological hypothesis. And one might think of it in the following way, and let me give here a very personal anecdote. It's, I hate to say it, 30 years ago, when I was a student in medicine, and I was aiming to be a doctor. I loved science, but to tell you the truth, I hated medical school. And working in hospitals, as one did in medical school in those days right from the start, I realized very quickly that I really didn't like being around sick people. And I didn't like a lot of the people in my medical school class who were a little bit too anxious for money and the kind of then absolute authority that doctors had in the world. This is before malpractice suits. There was a sense in which I kind of hated everything about it. And let me add, so I'm not misunderstood, I have great respect for doctors. I love my own doctor. But nevertheless, I came to realize, though very slowly at that time, that this wasn't me. That I loved science, but medicine was not what I was really meant to do. During that time, I was attending the lectures of the man from whom I eventually got my PhD over in the philosophy department. And as I sat listening to him talk about a philosopher whose name I didn't learn to spell, actually, and in particular, about 2/3 of the way through the term, talking about this curious idea called eternal recurrence, he said to me, and 100 other students, pretty much what I've just read to you. What if your life, every moment of suffering and pain and so on, you had to live over and over and over again? And I was indeed very unhappy and unhappy with myself at that time. Well, you can guess the ending of this story. Within 15 minutes after the class ended, I was off to the dean, and I quit medical school. I went into philosophy, and I never regretted it ever since. The idea is that eternal recurrence gives us a way of thinking about our own lives. Because I was really guilty of thinking, I hate this, but only a few more years. And then I get to, what, be an intern? And then I get to be a resident. And then I get to work in a hospital and work off my debts. Of course, my father encouraged that kind of thinking. But I came to realize that it was really self-destructive for me. And if this was a life I had to lead over and over again, then I had to live it a different way. And so the power in my own personal case, I think, was astounding. It changed my life. And here's an idea that Nietzsche throws out. Granted, he's talking about the will to power. Granted, he's talking about these other notions which may seem abstract to us. But when you try to apply them to your own case, they can have a powerful impact as an existential imperative.
I think this kind of test is, in a sense, a kind of Nietzschean alternative to the Christian examination of conscience, where indeed one is always looking forward to the next life and considering the details of this life always in terms of the next. I think that's one of the reasons that Nietzsche usually presents eternal recurrence in the form of something like a thought experiment. This idea of a demon coming to one in the middle of the night is not intended to be a terrifying picture of what actually will happen, but a kind of way of taking a perspective on your life. I think that also might explain why Nietzsche made so many notes suggesting something like a physical proof of eternal recurrence, even if he recognized that this would never make, these days, the Scientific American. I think what he had in mind was that we're so used to thinking of life as something that is led from past to future and in a single line and exists once and is altogether over, that it's almost impossible for us to really fully internalize a much more traditional vision that actually many of our ancestors in most societies had, the idea that time was actually a circle. Now, one of the reasons that people have difficulty dealing with this idea in Nietzsche is that it seems that it might make the meaning of life pretty questionable. After all, oftentimes we think that it makes a lot of difference that we learn to overcome our faults and improve in certain ways. Nietzsche himself would encourage that. So what good is a story that says, well, actually, sooner or later you'll come back to that beginning point where you haven't mastered this at all and you'll have to move uphill again? Worse yet, from the standpoint of the traditional story, it seems that there's really not a lot of freedom. It's often pointed out by Nietzsche scholars that if this really were a time that recurred eternally, and there was no difference between an occurrence the first time and its recurrence, we wouldn't know which this was. In fact, there'd be no way of differentiating this life, which we think we're doing as a kind of improvisation now, from a life that's been led hundreds, thousands, eternal times before. And if that's true, it seems that we don't really have much choice about the way we live, that we're all part of a pre-programmed sequence. I think Nietzsche turned in a way to physics as at least one arena that might explain things in terms of causal interconnection, where things do operate in methodical sequences, in a way that doesn't strike anyone as questioning the meaning of life. Partly it also points out that if we doubt the cyclical model, and physics would say the cyclical model makes sense, we really obviously are living with a lot of prejudice if we insist on the notion of linear time. And actually, if one thinks about the Big Bang Theory, I think there is a sense in which physics actually would be on Nietzsche's side here. But overall, there's a kind of deep prejudice against the idea of eternal recurrence in the Judeo-Christian world, because we do want some sense of freedom, of free will. Nietzsche has a tendency to look at free will as it's been described in the Judeo-Christian tradition as really a kind of effort to deflect blame, oddly enough. If we have a notion that human beings are free in their choices, that they have alternatives, and they make the choices they do because they've been free to do so, then we can always blame people when they do the wrong thing. Although it might look as though this notion of free will gives us reason to criticize ourselves, and indeed it does, what it ultimately leads to, Nietzsche thinks, is a kind of general reinforcement of the idea of looking outside you to find fault or to shift blame, a kind of way of uglifying the whole world around one. By contrast, he thinks the vision of eternal recurrence creates a very different attitude toward the world and the whole life in which one lives. He talks about this concept in terms of the expression amor fati, which we brought up earlier, the notion of love of fate. He comments, "I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful. Amor fati, let that be my love henceforth." What that suggests is that Nietzsche sees the model of eternal recurrence, which interconnects all events with all others, really, as providing a kind of way of looking at reality as intricately interconnected in a way that resembles the way a marvelous artwork has all the parts intimately interconnected. That it's a way of seeing as beautiful each element because it takes meaning within the context of the whole and gives the whole a part of its life. In a sense, it gives a kind of vision of the individual that connects the individual with the larger picture, but without denying the individual its own unique contribution. I think Nietzsche sees that as a very forceful and powerful idea, and one that tends to make our vision of reality more profound and more beautiful. On the other hand, how does this tie in with the notion of freedom? It's quite clear that Nietzsche doesn't think that we're free in a completely radical sense. He does think that human beings are motivated by some basic forces within them, basic drives, and that we're not free not to experience those things. The primary freedom he thinks that we have is really in what way do we deal with these internal drives? Do we express them directly or not? We have some choice about that. And in particular, we have some choice about whether we view ourselves as hapless victims of these forces or as active participants in life. And if freedom is a matter that concerns him, it's a matter of feeling free to really actively engage with your life, to deal with life in the present, despite all the things that are already settled about it, despite all the details of the present that you're not in any position to change, but to really take your role in the present in as active a possible way, in a sense, to really fully be yourself. That's the only kind of freedom that he thinks really makes sense for human beings to want, but fortunately, he thinks it's a kind of freedom that is really quite available to us.
One of our friends, a poet who worked for some years with Joseph Campbell, wrote an essay on death in which he referred to it as the bald scenario, and it can be very simply stated. It's our tendency to think of, well, we live, and then we die. Boom, nothing. End of story. And she contrasts this with the many myths and legends of ancient times and medieval times and other cultures, some of them still ongoing strong. And all of them have a talk about life, not necessarily in terms of an afterlife, and that's too often the only alternative that we think of, but rather in terms of an enrichment of life. Seeing life, for example, repeating through one's children, not a literal repetition of your life perhaps, but in a very important sense, an extension and expression of yourself, or the repetition of yourself in the culture that you live in, or the repetition of yourself in some divine or sacred manner, which is open to all sorts of religious interpretations. But the basic idea of saying yes to life also includes such things as an acceptance of death, but an acceptance of death not as simply final, although, believe me, Nietzsche did not accept the Christian notion of the afterlife. Nevertheless, he was very clear that there is a sense of immortality which is available, and available in particular to those who really excel. It's a notion that goes back to Plato, at least, and certainly one could take it long before that, but in his dialogue, The Symposium, which I talked about with reference to love, lecture 14, what we find is Homer being referred to as an immortal. Not that Homer had children. We don't know if he did or not. We don't even know for sure if there was a Homer. But Homer is immortal through his children, through his works, that is, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And Socrates states in the Symposium, who could possibly want any children compared to those? And the answer, I think, for Nietzsche is that he too thought of his life in terms of a kind of ongoing repetition, if you like, a repetition of his life, not in the same way and not the same lonely, sick man coming to life again and going through the same travails, but there's a sense in which Nietzsche saw his works themselves as his immortality. And his frequent comments, sometimes even very narcissistic comments about himself as a buffoon and why doesn't he succeed like Jesus and so on. Nevertheless, I think you can see this in a different light, and that is that what Nietzsche was aiming at was to give meaning to his life by doing something that went beyond his life. And doing great works is perhaps the best way to do that.
Indeed, this is a very clear case of Nietzsche's not attempting to say in any kind of clear way what sorts of ambitions would or wouldn't amount to trying to have influence beyond oneself. He leaves it entirely open. He thinks some people do it through having children, through building institutions, through planting trees. There are many ways in which an individual reaches beyond their finite lifespan into the future and into this whole cycle of time that's going to proceed before one. And indeed, the myth, in a sense, recreates one throughout the entire timeline. You can almost see the idea of time as a circle as suggesting that there's no absolute point where your existence fully ends or begins. True, there's a sense in which we do have a sense of ending with death, but that's only a provisional ending. There's also no particular moment where one is judged absolutely. And this, too, he sees as a kind of deficit in the Judeo-Christian tradition, where the point of death is a point at which judgment comes completely, that the state of your soul at that point is the final determinant of your salvation or damnation. Instead, eternal recurrence is a vision in which each moment in the timeline is as important as every other, and also has a kind of reflection or influence on all the others. One exists in a way as a drop of water in a wave, but one has, in a sense, the whole life of the wave as part of one's own reality, and that he takes very seriously. So he thinks this is a very important idea because it provides an alternative to the traditional view from his background, to a way of looking at the individual's life as being meaningful in a kind of full sense, but not one that depends on a notion of eternal life after the grave as being a way of getting that.
Aristotle considers in his Ethics the curious question whether a person can be called happy until he's dead, or for that matter, even after. It's a curious question because when we think of happiness, we think of it as a state of mind, and the current American answer would be, of course, when you're dead, you're finished being happy. But that's it. What Aristotle had in mind, of course, wasn't simply feeling happy, but Aristotle had in mind a word that's usually translated as flourishing. But I think in Nietzschean terms, we might think of it as a kind of self-realization. In terms of one Greek poet he admires, Pindar, becoming who you are. But that's not something that ends with death. Aristotle, in his musings, considers the following example. A man who is greatly respected in Athens dies, but his children then rebel against the state or are involved in some deep scandal, besmirching the family name. There's a sense in which the events after the man's death deeply affect his flourishing. He may be dead, but nevertheless, what's important about him, what is surviving about him, is his reputation, his good name, his family, and now through the behavior of his children, that's been ruined. So too, Nietzsche sees quite clearly that what he is and his becoming, who he can be, doesn't end with his rather pathetic death in 1900, but rather is going on even as we lecture, and what we make of him, and what you make of him. There's a sense in which what it means to be immortal, what it means to live on and repeat your life, has to do with the way in which you continue to survive. Now, with Nietzsche, we have a name to attach. With most people, in a sense, they disappear from history, But nevertheless, as Kathy used in this Taoist image of the drop in the wave, nevertheless, they continue to exist in the wave itself. Now, Aristotle has another notion which I think is very relevant here as a way of starting to bring this all to a close. We've repeated many times Pinder's phrase, become who you are, and we've related this to Nietzsche's perhaps ill-chosen phrase, the will to power, saying that what he means by will to power is ultimately a kind of self-expression and self-realization. But all this really leaves open the question, now, what exactly does Nietzsche want us to be? Well, this is made problematic by the fact that he refuses, in effect, to give us any concrete advice, and we quoted Zarathustra now several times, don't follow me, just find your own way, find out what's inside of you. But there is something that Nietzsche says in Gay Science which I think is extremely valuable in this sense, and that is, give style to your character, the great art. Now what that means is not fashion, it's not sort of being stylish, but rather it's making something of what you have and who you are. The notion of fate that Kathy just brought up again, and the love of fate, has to do with something that many of us find fairly difficult, namely loving who you are and loving what you've got to work with. That doesn't mean being satisfied or content. What it means is loving, accepting what you've got to work with, and then making something beautiful out of it. When we were talking about resentment and slave morality, one of the points we made was that what the slave does is takes his flaws and turns those flaws in a way into weapons by redescribing them as good. And that's distinctive of slave mentality of resentment. But this is something very different. One of the examples that Nietzsche uses, which I'm sure was tongue-in-cheek, was Napoleon's speech impediment, which in his position of power he employed as a way of making people pay attention to him all the more. And if you think about Nietzsche himself, here's a very sick, lonely man. What do you do when you're physically ill? What do you do when you find yourself temperamentally or circumstantially just alienated from other people? And what Nietzsche did was he gave shape to himself. One of our favorite Nietzsche scholars and a good friend has argued that what Nietzsche does basically is what Plato does with Socrates. That what he did was he gave shape to himself as an author, as what we now know as Nietzsche, and in a way the man with the mustache becomes almost irrelevant to the creation that Nietzsche has become.
In a way, it's all an art of transfiguration. And I think transfiguration, despite or perhaps even because of its resonance with the Christian background, is a term that explains a lot of what Nietzsche sees as desirable in living. It's taking your own traits and giving them a setting. I'm reminded of Messiaen writing a composition while in a concentration camp where there were musicians who played various instruments that normally wouldn't be in an ensemble together. And yet, taking the resources he has, he creates this masterpiece. In a sense, Nietzsche thinks all of us have that as a kind of project that we can engage in with ourselves. In a way, he does follow Aristotle, who thinks we are born with certain kinds of traits or temperamental endowments, but we wouldn't really call those virtues, even if they're endowments people like, until we've gained some control over them and found the right occasions to use the particular traits we have. Say someone is born with a disposition toward a hot temper. That can be a problem for the person and for those around the person. On the other hand, it can be directed in a way that makes that person a really powerful influence on his or her society. If you take a kind of tendency toward anger and turn that into motivation to work for a cause, say, that can sometimes work to stellar results, both for oneself and for others. And again, this notion that the distinction between individual and the community is overplayed, an idea that Nietzsche has, it should be recognized in this connection that Nietzsche does think that the individual does play off other people and vice versa. In fact, in the passage where he talks about giving style to one's character, he concludes by saying the important thing is that a person takes some satisfaction in himself or herself. If not, all the rest of us will be his or her victims. And I think that what he has in mind there is that none of us are really so much an island as we come to think of ourselves. Again, this is an argument against the Christian vision, where the individual soul has its own vocation. For Nietzsche, it really is the here and now in the community. We'll conclude with one of his final statements of eternal recurrence. Whoever has really gazed down with an Asiatic and super-Asiatic eye into the most world-denying of all possible modes of thought, beyond good and evil, and no longer like Buddha and Shopenhauer under the spell and illusion of morality, perhaps by this very act, without really desiring it, may have opened his eyes to the opposite ideal, the ideal of the most high-spirited, energetic, and world-affirming man, who has not only learned to come to terms with and assimilate with what it was and is, but who wants to have it again as it was and is to all eternity, insatiably calling out, once more. Thanks.